All right, we have four functions here, and we want to find the domain of them all. Remember, the domain are the good x values. So in other words, this first one, what could I plug in for x that wouldn't bother this function? Well, I mean, could you plug in 0? Sure. A negative number? Sure. So in other words, all real numbers or from negative infinity to infinity. The main times you have to worry about domains, dividing by zeros and taking square roots of negative numbers. So something like this is always going to be all real numbers. So this next one, we never, ever, 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 ever want to divide by 0. So what we do is we say, well, what would make the denominator 0? And if you have a more complicated denominator, you should go ahead and write it out. So in other words, I'm going to set this equal to 0, and then I'm going to solve for x, which we can look at and see. So in other words, on a number line, this can be any number, okay? Any of these numbers out here wouldn't matter. If I have a negative 7, so what? I just have a negative denominator. Any of these numbers up here would be fine. So how we write that is from minus infinity all the way up to 6, and you cannot touch 6, so you use a parentheses. Union, jump to the other side of 6, you cannot touch it, and then head out to infinity. So that would be that domain. All right. Then as I mentioned, you have to worry about square roots because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So what you want to do here is say, well, what would make this less than 0? 0 is okay, right? Because if let's say I plug in and you can kind of see negative 14. And so I would get the square root of 0, which is just 0. So that's okay. But if I plugged in, so going back to our number line, if I plugged in something to the left down here, like negative 20, anything that's going to be bigger than 14 to make this negative, that's not going to work. So I can use 14, so negative 14, so I'd use my square bracket, and then anything above it, right? I mean, you can use 15, 16, 17, anything like that. So what you typically do with something like this is, as you can kind of see, you figure out what would make this equal 0. So that brings me to this one, where sometimes you might have to write it out and say, well, if I solve this, so I end up with adding 10 on both sides, then I divide by 2. I see that if x equals 5, 5 times 2, 10 minus 10, that's okay, because I get the square root of 0 again. So this would be the same thing, but starting at 5 is okay, and heading up to infinity. So just remember, domains only get kind of crazy if you're dividing, because you don't want to divide by 0, and then looking at square roots because you don't want to take the square root of a negative number.